Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler.
I'm Susan Catto.
And this is our new series, our new podcast called Still a Classic, where we debate classics of old and new and decide that they still merit that moniker. We are interpreting classics pretty broadly, right?
Yeah, it's something that could be written hundreds of years ago. It could be on school curricula. Maybe you read it in university. Or it could be something that was a huge popular hit that everybody talked about at the time and sold millions of copies.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to be vague about it. We're going to focus on books. We may veer into other topics, other films, or maybe other types of medium. But for now, it's really books. And there's so many classics to uncover. So I don't think we will be hard-pressed to find any ones. Today's is this still a classic question is the remains of the day. So I will preamble this by saying that I am obsessed with the author Kazuo Ishiguro. I actually realized I haven't read everything he's written, but I thought I did. And I love him. I love him in the way that I will buy his hardcover books as soon as they hit the stores. So, I mean, I say that about so few people. But for example, when Clara and the Sun came out, I bought it right away in hardcover and I read it in like 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And Clara and the Sun was also one that I read right away. And then Never Let Me Go, another book of his that I just
love that book as well. Yeah.
But what started it all for me was reading The Remains of the Day. And this is one of those books that I read soon after it came out, and rereading it again for this podcast was such an interesting experience.
So I do wonder if I read this book the first time. I'm trying to remember if it was in university, it may have been on the curriculum for one of my many literature courses. But I do remember at the time being blown away by the book.
Mm-hmm. It came out in 1989.
It did come out in 1989. So it was, and interestingly, it takes place in 1956, right?
It takes place in 1956, but the bulk of the action of the book is the reminiscence of the butler, Stevens. So he's remembering actual pre-war events. In the great house in which he serves as butler to Lord Darlington. So you may be familiar with butlers from the works of P.G. Wodehouse, or you may be a fan of Downton Abbey.
So it's interesting. You know, I didn't make the connection between The Remains of the Day and Downton Abbey until you mentioned it. It's true. There seems to be a resurgence of interest in the inner workings of British households and the royalty and not the royalty in so much this book, but the aristocracy.
Yes. In a way, as soon as I didn't think of Downton Abbey once while I was rereading this book. And then once I thought of it, I was like, it's pretty obvious that Julian Fellowes based Carson on Stevens in this book. This idea of the incredibly dignified, incredibly restrained, stuffy butler who is quite judgmental about the staff, insists everything be perfect for the family, but with some pretty crucial differences in that we really get to see Carson emote and become a very feeling man, and even become married to the chief housekeeper. Again, I would say a reference to Remains of the Day.
And spoiler alert, that is not what happens in The Remains of the Day at all. So it is fascinating. So yes, English, but it focused on English butler named Stevens at a great home, a great estate called Darlington Hall. I mean, it's every stereotype you have about the British aristocracy, rich, full. Fascinating. It is told in the first person narration, which, I was thinking, again, I can say just maybe from the books I've read in the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years, I don't come across a lot of first person narration anymore. So especially classic works, like important works, don't seem to be first person narration that often anymore. Is that
I would say that is true. But wasn't Claire and the Sun first person?
Oh, you are right. I believe Claire and the Sun was
first robot.
First robot. You know what? I would maybe we need to add that to our repertoire. I don't know if it's considered a classic, but I think we would have some
Yes.
thoughts about it.
Yes.
So yeah, he's also an unreliable narrator, which everyone loves a good unreliable narrator.
Oh, yeah, you have to love a good unreliable narrator. And in this, the very way he writes with all the by the ways and the changing the topic and the kind of distance that he puts between himself and the reader as he tells his story is, I mean, it's part and parcel of the emotional weight of the story itself. It's the way this man interacts with his world, is the way he is interacting with us as the reader, and we are forced to read between the lines and in some ways listen to what the other characters say to him. All the big revelations about what he's feeling come from his recounting what other characters have said to him.
Right. It is fascinating. I mean, in terms of a classic, so this would be a clear-cut classic. I mean, I can't remember if I even found out how many copies it sold, but I mean, the book won the Booker Prize. I mean, I think there's no bigger definition of a classic than a winner of a Booker Prize. And the author went on to win the Nobel Prize. So, I mean, it's, I think that's a default classic work of literature, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. It makes every list of, some of the lists, it makes 1,000 novels everyone must read.
Right.
It placed 8th in one survey of 150 literary writers voting on the best British, Irish, or Commonwealth novel from 1980 to 2005. And I would say for me, it's like on my top 10 list.
Right. I mean, it is definitely a book that if you haven't read, you should read it. So, I mean, let's talk a bit about the plot.
Okay. So when the novel starts, Stevens is working actually for an American. It's the 50s. An American man owns the estate now and is and Stevens came with it as part of the English charm. And it's almost like the guy's like, it's like a little theme park for this rich American to have this English butler. So you're introduced to him in the awkwardness of him trying to cope with an American as his boss who really likes to banter. One thing that is forgotten about this book, because it is so sad and so moving, is it's also very funny. He realizes he needs to banter and small talk. But one thing that comes to me is, as I read this, is the character now, if this were written now, people would say this person is on the spectrum. He does not get social cues. He does not, banter is not something that will come naturally to him. And to see him try to adjust to this new informality, it is some of the unintentional comedy of the book, just as his inability to read the signs that other people are giving him or to express himself emotionally is the tragedy of the book as well. Okay, so that didn't tell me much about the plot.
Sorry. But, before you get to the plot, it's interesting you say that because yes, I think he would be perceived as, I guess, neuroatypical. But now that you mention it, and I don't want to diverge too much, but the character of the butler is actually very similar to the Clara and the Sun AI robot.
Yes.
In that also first person narration, you're right. Also unreliable narrator because she is a robot that can't actually perceive all human emotion yet.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways there's a lot of similarities there, right?
Crazy. It's so interesting because again, I didn't think of Clara and the Sun. And I was like, what kind of diversity is this writer capable of? That one minute he's writing about, a British country home, and the next minute he's writing a futuristic book about a robot. And his first 2 books are set in Japan. After the bomb hit Nagasaki, like he contains multitudes.
He really does. Okay, so
sorry. So the plot. So his boss is going away and says, Stevens, you should take a little vacation, and you can have the car. I'll pay for the petrol. So
petrol.
Stevens has received a letter recently from the former head housekeeper, and it occurs to him that Miss Kenton, who has left the house and been married for some years, who describes herself in this letter as leaving her husband. And he thinks, you know what, I should go see her because we could really use her help in this house. She's we need to hire her again. So that's his excuse for going off to see Miss Kenton. As the book progresses, he leaves and he starts his journey. And during the journey, he reminisces about the past and the house and Miss Kenton, what he's going to say to her and what their past was. And you get the whole story of about, I would say, maybe 5 really crucial pre-war years when he worked with Miss Kenton in the house. And you learn that basically this is a butler who perceived his duty as all-encompassing and in the service of greatness. And the greatness took the form of his well, as he refers to him, his master, Lord Darlington. And everything he did, he felt was a big deal and honorable because Lord Darlington was such a prominent figure, was so good in his mind, was not one of these men that, it's referenced that he wasn't one of these men who just spent his time playing polo. He was engaged in the affairs of the world, and he took a great deal of pride in serving such a man and really devoting his life. But then the question that arises in the book is, what happens if you've devoted your life to an ideal and that ideal turns out to be hollow?
Right. And I mean, that's actually the crux of the book. And I wonder, I mean, the themes, there's a lot of themes in the book in terms of loneliness, isolation, duty. And I think if we're looking at themes that will resonate over the eras, I mean, that theme of duty really, I think it's a thing that really is important nowadays as well, correct?
Yeah. To what degree is who you're working for, part of who you are as a person? Is it like, I think a lot of people are looking to respect their employer, to respect the mission of their company. And it can be devastating to work for a company that, turns out to be hollow.
After you realize that,
Yeah.
Let's just be, okay, let's say, there are, the acolytes, for example, let's say it's someone like an Elon Musk type figure, who thinks he's important, who thinks he's fixing the repair, the issues of the world. There's environmental degradation, there's, free speech. All those ideals that he espouses as being important to him, you can argue whether or not they are, his fan base will be his fan base and will fall to the ends of the earth because they think they are in the presence of greatness.
Yeah. And that's the butler's thing. And what you see in the book, gradually, as he recounts this past, you start to see him realize what he gave up in this quest for this mission of service to Lord Darlington. And what he gave up is essentially everything. Right. It's, his life, his feelings, his chance at love. It's so subtle, the description of Miss Kenton, that I almost want to go back and reread the book again once you get to the end. But when I think of the movie Remains of the Day, which I saw after reading the book, but which was such a powerful movie that I almost heard every line Miss Kenton said in the book in the voice of Emma Thompson. Much less so the butler, because it was her that stuck out to me. But the movie makes really clear that there is this connection between these two. He does not make that clear in his narration. It just comes out in these very subtle ways, mostly in her frustrated reaction to what she perceives as his inability. At one point she says, please, 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 why can't you just tell the truth? Or why can't you just, why do you have to pretend? Because something devastating will happen. He'll be like, very well. And then he won't react. Nothing will happen. And then he'll just describe a scene where he is serving, port to some gentleman, and they say, "What's wrong, Stevens? Are those tears on your face?" He's so out of touch with his feelings that, as I said, it has to be someone else who tells you that this is his reaction.
It's interesting to look at a character that repressed, and I think also there will be a subset of people that will really relate to that even to this day. He is an all-encompassing role, and I think it comes down to, today we talk a lot, especially in the workplace, about authenticity and being, who you are. But it's arguable whether or not people want who you are. They really want you to play a role, right?
Yes.
CEOs of companies, they don't come across as multifaceted.
No, they do not.
They come across as, single-handedly determined to, meet whatever their objective is, right?
And he feels that his role is to never let that facade drop. He literally says the only time a butler can let the human show rather than the butler is when he is alone. But there's one big exception to that, which you wish he would realize, which is when you are with the woman you love.
Correct. Yeah. No, that is. Let's just be frank. It's a beautiful book.
But some people will get so frustrated by his stiff upper lip and his, they will be like Miss Kenton herself, so enraged that they could just burst into tears at his insistence at keeping a stiff upper lip. I can imagine some people reading this saying, "I'm not going to bother with this man. Just get over yourself already," because we don't see a lot of that. I have, British relatives raised in that kind of tradition where they are very stiff upper lip. So I could really, I've always fantasized that there's a lot of deep feeling going on beneath all that stiff upper lipness. And this book kind of feeds that idea,
Right.
although he really doesn't let it slip. It's a fantastic book. What can I say?
Compared to some of the other books we've read, recently for this
Mm-hmm,
podcast, the prose is gorgeous.
I'm not trying to make this sound like a love story either. There's a really important political plot line to this. He is watching as politics happen behind the scenes. What he's saying is it's not, and he's correct about, the butler is correct about this. The real history is being made not in the Houses of Parliament. It's being made in these country houses where the rich landowners meet with politicians. And Lord Darlington basically serves as a go-between for people representing the Nazi government, basically, right. and the British government, and any efforts to ward off the possibility of war, which over time can have, and it's quite clear, veers into appeasement. And at one point, Lord Darlington is exposed as essentially, taking some quite anti-Semitic activities, and he fires the 2 Jewish people on staff, and he presents it as, well, Stevens, you need to fire them because it would be uncomfortable for some of my guests. And it'd be uncomfortable for them too. And Stevens is horrified, but he does not show that.
So I think so that is actually critical, I think, part of this book. I mean, a boss, Lord Darlington, who is a Nazi sympathizer, essentially, the butler, following orders,
just following orders,
and not saying anything and not speaking up. And I think that that pivotal moment will actually resonate with a lot of us. I mean, at what times do you speak up? When do you when do you voice your displeasure with your company, your boss, to say, what, this is actually not in line with the times, or this is something you will come to regret, because there is a bit of guilt by association.
Yes. And it's really interesting. I don't want to give the whole plot, but it's very interesting how Miss Kenton reacts to this firing, her own horror at it, her outspokenness about it, her saying she'll quit over it. And then what happens after that is one of the more pivotal interactions between the two of them. And maybe one of the things that is most heartbreaking for her is that he thinks, well, of course it should be obvious to her that I also think this is wrong. All she sees is what he says, which is, this is what Lord Darlington says, and Lord Darlington is always right, and I must obey what Lord Darlington says. Later, he's like, but of course, I mean, I knew it was wrong. She's like, no.
But
it would have meant the world to me if you had said that.
Right. And that is actually very true. I mean, it is a warning for everyone who stays silent on the sidelines, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's, and she's not without her own guilt in that situation as well, because threatening to quit, and she doesn't quit. And we later find out why she doesn't quit, which is the same reason so many of us don't quit terrible situations, which is she has nowhere to go and she has nowhere to work and she needs the job. There's so much in this book. I think that the movie is really excellent and I highly recommend it too, but do not cheat yourself out of the experience of reading the book just because you've seen the movie.
So, even though this was written in 1989, we should add that it comes up again and again, and The Remains of the Day has its devotees that still write about it and how much the book left impact on them. I mean, just in 2016, there was a Guardian review and the author actually says that he's almost tired himself out because he can't stop talking about this book, and it's so many years later. And he's handed out copies to everyone he knows, to the point where people are nauseated by it. He writes about, this is how he writes about Stevens saying, we get a picture of a man trying desperately to keep a lid on his emotions, and what a complete picture it is. The Remains of the Day does the most wonderful thing of work a literature can do. It makes you feel like you hold a human life in your hands. And when you reach the end, it really does seem as if you've lost a friend, a laughably pompous, party hat refusing, stick in the mud friend, but a good friend nonetheless. You want to give him a hug, except he'd be outraged.
Yeah, that's a very good description. And again, like, you can go watch Downton Abbey and imagine what would happen if Carson never had those warm scenes with, with the master's daughter, or never had a romance.
Well, so that's interesting. Okay, let's say it came out today. How do you think it'd be received?
I think it's very slow moving
Mhm.
compared to today's literature. I couldn't, when I started rereading it, I kind of couldn't believe at first how slow it was moving and how digressive.
Right. Right.
It's not a plot driven book. And I think that would hold it back from being recognized immediately. I think a lot of people would think, what does this matter? Why do we care about this colonial British blah, blah, blah? What they would miss in that case would be that this is really an evisceration of, you know, the merits of that kind of life. Both the idea of masters and
Correct.
servants and great houses. It's not an endorsement. So I think that it would seem so far out of touch
Like a
for so
little
many people.
Anachronistic for a
Yeah,
lot of people.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and in terms of the, unrequited love part of the story, I mean, it's hard because we talk about Downton Abbey, and people do want to see.
Yeah, they just
want
want to like get over it.
They want you to be authentic.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
the inauthenticity of the main character is a little startling, even for a certain.
He can't even talk to his own father.
Right. There's the father-son relationship in this book as well.
It becomes very clear that he learned all this at his father's knee. His father was one of the great butlers of his day, and but when his father ages, and even towards the end of his life, is like, I hope I was a good dad to you. Like, Stevens just changes the subject.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a depiction of a certain kind of emotional avoidance that will be familiar to many people. And if you're not familiar with it, you'll probably be going, that is really messed up.
That's true, actually. Okay, so I mean, I feel almost guilty. We don't want to give it away, but we are both such big fans. Maybe it was unfair for us to review this, but okay, let's say, okay, we have our buttons, and we're going to
assess whether this book is indeed still a classic.
Okay, ready?
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
What a shock. Okay, we both loved it. It is still a classic. I think it will always be considered a classic. The Remains of the Day. Go out, buy it, read it, enjoy it. And if it's not your cup of tea, then go buy his other books. I mean, Clara and the Sun. I mean, God, amazing, right?
Incredible. And then Never Let Me Go. You got the teenagers and all that youthfulness, very different in tone than this book. So, but you got to go out and read some Kazuo Ishiguro.
Right.
Sorry.
So until next time, thank you, everyone. Again, Leah Eichler and Susan Catto, and this is still a classic. Speak to you soon. Bye, everybody.